Holder Group, the Global Campaign for Education, International Council for Adult Education, Global Students Forum, the Global Campaign for Education US, and the government of Argentina. I want to welcome you all to this high-level political forum 2022 side event, the right to education and lifelong learning, the new normality in a broken world. Our side event focuses on the enable potential of the right to education and how Sustainable Development Goal 4 is a lever for the entire Sustainable Development Agenda. I am delighted to introduce a very diverse group of speakers who have experience in different parts of the world and who will highlight the importance of investing more financial resources to protect the right to education and to really embrace this idea of transforming education. I mean to really secure the needs for everyone, depend in the regard where they are, to have the possibility to enjoy the right to education and to really take the lenses of people who are living in very difficult situations. I mean, people with disabilities, people who are facing different emergencies related to climate change, violence, human rights abuses, or people who are simply put away from the right to education because of their gender identity, sexual orientation, or just because who they are. So we really need to take the lenses of equality and to fight any form of discrimination and exclusion and to secure everyone's right to education. First of all, we are going to hear Mr. Rifat Sabat, the president of the Global Campaign for Education, who will be talking about education for peace and recovery. Then I will give the floor to Mr. Alberto Croce, the Minister of Education in Argentina, who will be an intervention from the government and from his experience. And after that, I will welcome Mr. Katarina Popovich, Secretary General of the International Council for Adult Education, who will be reflecting about learning and the process of learning in the middle of a crisis. And last but not least, we will welcome Mr. Hector Ulloa, the GC's board president of SAIA, who will be talking about the student rights through the pandemic. So welcome everyone. Please use the chat box and see that we have interpretation, simultaneous interpretation in French, Portuguese, and Spanish. And be ready to participate and use the chat box for comments, questions. They are absolutely welcome. Over to you, Rifat. Thank you very much for making time for our side event today. Can you hear me, Rifat? Are you there?
Thank you, Luis. Sorry, I wasn't muted. Thank you, Luis. I will speak in Arabic. Actually, I am tired a little bit, so if I speak English, maybe it will appear as a Chinese. So I will try to speak in Arabic this time. So I will switch. Where is the icon? I don't know where is the icon of yes. مرحبا للجميع وشكرا لسكرتاريا الحملة العالمية للتعليم لتنظيم هذا الورشة في سياق المنتدى السياسي رفيع المستوى والذي يجري الآن في نيويورك. السؤال الذي طرح فيما يتعلق في دور التعليم في التعافي والسلام أثار انتباهي، لأنه في كثير من الدول التي تعاني من حالات طوارئ وصراعات، يعني كلمة سلام أحيانا بتكون صعب يفهموها بسياقاتهم، يعني بدون ما يتم التطرق للعدالة والمساءلة والمسؤولية. وبالتالي كثير من المناطق التي تعاني من صراعات، يعني على سبيل المثال فلسطين أو أوكرانيا أو اليمن أو ليبيا أو كل الدول التي يعني تعاني من صراعات، وخاصة صراعات مسلحة التي تلقي بظلالها على تقسيم المجتمعات من حيث اللغة والإثنيات والمناطق والأحزاب السياسية، وبالتالي الصراع يكون في كثير من الأحيان دموي، إضافة إلى الطوارئ أو المتعلقة بالكوارث مثل البانديميك، الأزمة التي حدثت. وبالتالي في هذه السياقات السؤال فعلا المطروح هو العدل. الناس تبحث أحيانا عن العدل، يعني في الجائحة، في أزمة الجائحة وما تلاها من سياسات تعليمية إذا جاز التعبير والتركيز على سياق التعليم، فقدت العدالة. لم يكن هناك لا مساواة ولا عدالة، لا في توزيع الموارد ولا في تنمية القدرات ولا في العمل على وصول الناس للتعليم. والكل منا بيعرف أزمة التعليم عن بعد وما أحدثته من تداعيات في إقصاء الكثيرين من الناس الذين لم يكن يمتلكوا القدرات والإمكانيات التكنولوجية، سواء كان متعلق في وصولهم للإنترنت أو وصولهم للأدوات اللي بتساعدهم للوصول إلى التعليم، كونه يعني الدول استخدمت التكنولوجيا في قضية التعليم عن بعد. حتى ما بين الدول ما كانش في عدالة، وبالتالي الدول التي كانت تمتلك الإمكانيات التكنولوجية الهائلة وكل مجتمعاتها كانت معدة ومدربة على استخدام التكنولوجيا، في نفس الوقت معظم دول الجنوب لم تكن على علم حتى في الزوم، يعني عرفوا مؤخرا، ولم يكن لديهم الإمكانيات للتعامل مع كل الابليكيشن أو المنصات التي يعني تم إنتاجها في فترة الجائحة، ولا الحكومات كانت قادرة تتعامل مع الموضوع. ولهذا سبب دول الجنوب يمكن في سياساتها وفي تحركاتها أخذت وقت كبير حتى قدرت تصل لقضية توفير الإمكانيات لجزء من الناس مش كل الناس. فبالتالي العدالة كانت مفقودة، فما بالك العدالة في دول فيها صراعات مسلحة، تناقضات أو حرب أهلية داخلية، وتأتي الجائحة لتزيد من الوضع سوء في هذا الوضع. هذا في سياق آخر قد لا يراه الناس. في المجتمعات التي تعاني من صراعات ومن تناقضات يصبح العنف مقبولا أخلاقيا عند الناس. وانظر ماذا يحدث في كثير من الدول. في أزمة أوكرانيا تتحول الدولة أو المجتمعات تتحول في لحظة، في ليلة وضحاها كما يقولون، من منظومة تعليم بتركز على التربية المدنية، على قيم المواطنة، قيم المساواة، قيم التسامح، لا قيم بسموها التربية الوطنية. وبالتالي النزعات الشوفينية الوطنية الذاتية بتطلع، وبالتالي بصير الخطاب كله خطاب وطني غير قابل للتسامح، خطاب وطني في نوع من الكراهية، خطاب وطني في نوع من التحريض على العنف. وبالتالي في التعليم في الطوارئ يجب الانتباه لهذا القضية، إنه قضايا القيم المدنية بشكل عام والتضامن المجتمعي والتكافل الاجتماعي والتماسك الاجتماعي يصبح في خطر. هذا يؤثر على حالة التضامن العالمي وقد تنتج العنصرية، وهذا ما حدث. إذا يعني حتى في موضوع اللاجئين، ونحن نتحدث عن الطوارئ، واللاجئين هم جزء من إنتاج حالات الطوارئ. ما حدث في أزمة أوكرانيا وروسيا أن اللاجئين السوريين، اللاجئين من الشرق الأوسط تعرضوا للتنمر، وبالتالي أصبحت هناك مقاربات. هذا يحدث ويؤثر في مناطق أخرى. أنا لا أستبعد منطقة، أنا لا أستبعد بلد. وبالتالي في الأزمات الصحية والأزمات السياسية والأزمات الاجتماعية العنف يصبح مقبولا أخلاقيا، وينتج عنه أيضا عنصرية مقبولة بتصير، لا تسامح، لا تضامن، بتصير الشوفينية هي الأعلى، الوطنية هي اللي بتصير أكثر. لهذا السبب الدعوة يجب أن تكون في العمل على المواطنة العالمية، وإذا أردت أن أسميها المواطنة الكواكبية، بمعنى planted citizenship مش globalization. احنا بنحكي عن مواطنة إنسانية اللي يجب أن تعزز في حالات الطوارئ، سواء كانت هذه الطوارئ أو هذه الأزمات صحية أو اجتماعية أو سياسية. في هذه البلدان التي تعاني من صراعات أيضا قضية أخرى قد لا يراها الناس. قد يرى الناس بيوت تهدم، ناس تقتل، شوارع تسكر، الناس مش قادرة تروح المستشفيات، الناس مش عارفة تصل للتعليم. ولكن في قضايا لها علاقة بالجانب النفسي الاجتماعي، في هناك تدمير ممنهج للحالة النفسية الاجتماعية، وبالتالي تقليل الثقة بالذات وخلق ما يسمى بخلل داخلي فيما يتعلق بالتوازن النفسي داخل كل فرد. وبالتالي بيتم ضرب التوازن النفسي على مستوى الفرد، يصير في هناك خلل، هذا الخلل الفردي ينتقل بحيث يصبح خلل في التوازن داخل المجتمع. والفرد عندما يحدث له خلل في التوازن النفسي نتيجة الحالة السياسية أو الحالة الاجتماعية أو الحالة الصحية أو الشعور بالخوف أو الشعور بالرعب أو الشعور باللا مساواة أو الشعور باللا عدالة، هذا أيضا ينتج سلوك غير متوازن. وبالتالي تدخل المجتمعات في دوامة باللا سلم واللا سلام. لهذا السبب إعادة العافية فيما يتعلق في السلام قد تكون أهم من استعادة العافية فيما يتعلق في التعليم، لأنك لن تستطيع استعادة العافية فيما يتعلق في التعليم إلا إذا استعدت العافية على مستوى السلام الداخلي الفردي، وبالتالي السلام الداخلي المجتمعي. الناس يجب أن ترتاح داخليا لتستطيع أن تتعلم. فبالتالي التعليم العاطفي الاجتماعي مهم جدا في سياق هذه المناطق، أو في السياقات التي تعاني من صراعات، أو في السياقات التي تعاني من أزمات أو كوارث، سواء كانت زلازل أو براكين أو أمراض ووباءات. الآن فيما يتعلق في التعليم في هذه المناطق، أنا أتفق مع من وضع المعايير الدولية، يعني لن نأتي بشيء خارج إطار ما تم الاتفاق عليه دوليا، وكنا جزء من هذا الاتفاق كحملة عالمية للتعليم. أولا لن نستطيع أن نحدد مساراتنا فيما يتعلق في التعليم بالطوارئ إلا بمشاركة مجتمعية ومشاركة شمولية، لأنك لن تستطيع أن تلبي احتياجات كافة قطاعات المجتمع بدون أن يشارك المجتمع. ويجب أن تعتمد اللامركزية في المشاركة، لأنه في حالات الصراعات، يعني ممكن أنا لأني أحد الناس اللي بيعيش في منطقة فيها صراعات، أحيانا يصعب عليك الوصول للمحيط، تتقسم، يعني يقسموا أوصال البلد، وبالتالي في هناك صعوبة لتجميع الناس حتى في منطقة واحدة، وبالتالي تصبح كل محافظة، كل مدينة، كل قرية معزولة عن الأخرى. لهذا السبب بالضرورة أن يكون هناك لا مركزية في المشاركة ومنظم. فالمشاركة الشمولية يجب أن تكون أيضا لها علاقة بكل فئات المجتمع من حيث الدين، الجنس، العرق، كل هذه القضايا اللي بنرتكز عليها فيما يتعلق في حقوق الإنسان. فبالتالي بالضرورة أن ننطلق من حقوق الإنسان في التعامل مع التعليم في الطوارئ. لا يجوز أن ننطلق فقط من حالة إنسانية. إذا انطلقنا فقط من إغاثة إنسانية نتناسى قضايا لها علاقة في الحق في التعليم وحق الناس في الوصول إلى هذا التعليم بغض النظر عن الحالة، عن الأوضاع التي يعيشونها. فبالتالي المشاركة ضرورية. اثنين، بالضرورة تحديد وتخصيص الموارد في تعليم الطوارئ، ويجب أن يكون هناك نوع من الدقة في تحديد الموارد. أحيانا بصير عشوائية في التعامل، يعني بدنا نعمل تعليم عن بعد وبدون دراسة دقيقة لشو اللي بنملكه. ما يحدث إنه كثير من الدول، يعني مثلا بجوز هلا في أوكرانيا كل الناس بتودي نفس الشيء، تودي كمبيوترات. بالتالي تحديد الموارد هذا يساعد البلد على تحديد احتياجاتها، وبالتالي هذا أيضا يحتاج إلى أن تشارك كافة فئات المجتمع في تحديد الموارد، وما هي الإمكانيات التي الموجودة في البلد اللي ممكن تتعامل مع هذه الموارد. وبالتالي نستطيع تخصيص الموارد اللازمة للتعامل مع التعليم في الطوارئ. هذا مهم جدا في سياق انه الدعوه للممولين ان ينسقوا فيما بينهم وينسقوا مع البلد. هناك اشكاليه في قضيه التعليم في الطوارئ، انا هذا يمكن موقفي الشخصي. هناك في فجوه ما بين المجتمعات المحليه او البلد التي تعاني من ازمات وتوجهات الممولين. كثير من الممولين الذين يتواجدوا او المؤسسات الدوليه التي تتواجد وتعمل في بلدان اللي فيها صراعات هي تعمل لصالحها، وبالتالي توجهاتها بتكون الحفاظ على مسار شغلها، على مسار عملها، على مسار تمويلها. وهناك فجوه في رصد احتياجات المجتمع، فبالتالي بدون رصد احتياجات حقيقيه للمجتمع ومشاركه المجتمع في تحديد هذه الاحتياجات لن تكون هذه الدفعات او هذا التمويل او هذا الدعم مفيد للناس. وبالتالي احترام وجهات النظر، احترام احتياجات المجتمع المحلي، اشراكهم، الثقه بهم، لانه كثير من الاشياء التي تحدث في كثير من المناطق فيها نوع من التشكيك. يعني مثلا ما يحدث باليمن، هناك مجموعه ممكن بدها تعطي تمويل لليمن، فبيبدوا يعني اول قضيه بصير فيها التشكيك في قدره الناس الموجودين على ارض التعامل مع هذه المبالغ، وبالتالي احيانا ممكن يطلبوا منهم 50 وثيقه مشان يقدروا يودوا لهم مبلغ صغير. وبالتالي هذه الحاله من عدم الثقه لا تساعد في التضامن مع البلدان التي تعيش حالات تناقض. لازم يجب مغادره عدم الثقه بقدره الناس الموجودين على الارض. التنسيق مهم، التنسيق ما بين الخارج والداخل، ما بين الداخل، وانا يعني هذا ممكن يتوجه للبلدان. في موضوع التعليم في الطوارئ لا يمكن ان تحدث اختراق جدي في موضوع التعليم الا اذا كان هناك تنسيق على مستوى الحكومه بكل، على مستوى المجتمع المدني بكل اطيافه، والتنسيق ما بين المجتمع المدني المحلي والحكومه المحليه من جهه، وايضا التنسيق ما بين المجتمع البلد والخارج. لا يجب ان يترك المؤسسات الدوليه كانت حكومات ولا مؤسسات غير حكوميه ان تفعل على خاطرها. يجب ان يكون هناك احترام للبلد، وبالتالي التحرك بناء على احتياجات البلد. وهذا يتطلب من الفاعلين في البلد والمؤسسات الدوليه ان تقوم بتحليل دقيق لخطه العمل او لمسار العمل فيما يتعلق في استعاده العافيه، فيما يتعلق في التعليم عندما نتحدث على التعليم. وهذا يقتضي ايضا عمليه تقييم مستمر، والتقييم يجب ان لا تكون فقط بالخبراء. الخبراء لا يساعدوا كثيرا، احيانا عندما يقيموا مشروع بقيموها بطريقه تقليديه فجه لا تساعد. ما يساعد هو ان تقوم الفئات المستهدفه هي من تقيم المشروع واستفادتها، مثل ما يحدث الان في موضوع الترانسفورماتيف اديوكيشن سمت او فكره التعليم تحويل التعليم. من يقرر انه هذا من استفاد؟ الذي يقرر من استفاد هم الطلاب. فيجب ان يكون تقييم التعليم هو الطلاب. الطالب هو اللي بيقول لك انا انبسطت ما انبسطتش، تعلمت ما تعلمتش، حبيت ما حبيتش، مش الاستاذ ولا حدا من خارج المدرسه في الموضوع. فبالتالي الطلاب هم اللي بيقرروا شو هي مسار التعليم، شو اللي بيستفيدوه، شو اللي بيتعلموه. نفس الحكي فيما يتعلق في التعليم في الطوارئ، البلد هي اللي بتعرف شو اللي بيصير وشو اللي بيصيرش في هذا الموضوع. فالتقييم يجب ان يكون ايضا شمولي في قضيه الوصول لمدى فاعليه التعليم. وبالتالي خطه العمل يجب ان تاخذ بعين الاعتبار هواجس وقيم وتوجهات وثقافه المجتمعات المحليه، والا لن تنجح اي خطط لاستعاده العافيه فيما يتعلق في التعليم والسلام في اي منطقه تعاني صراعات. لا يمكن ان تذهب الى اوكرانيا او تذهب لفلسطين او لليمن او للسودان او للصومال بدون ان تفهم ثقافه الناس، بدون ان تفهم ميولهم وقيمهم واليات شغلهم. هذا مهم جدا لنجاحك. وبالتالي ايضا على المستوى المحلي، على مستوى البلد، يجب ان تؤقلم المناهج لقضايا التعليم في الطوارئ. لا يعقل انك يعني انه استاذ مثلا يبقى يدرس عن البحر وفي انفجارات بحد المدرسه، يعني الطلاب مش حيفهموا عن البحر وهو سامع انفجارات. وبالتالي المناهج يجب ان تكون مؤقلمه للسياق الموجود في الناس، ومن هناك أنت بتطور المناهج. وبهذا الإطار يجب التركيز على قضايا حقوق الإنسان. يجب التركيز على قضايا حقوق الإنسان، لأنه أكثر قضية ممكن يتم انتهاكها هي قضايا حقوق الإنسان. انظر ما يحدث، قد لا يرى الناس ما يحدث داخل البلدان. أكثر شيء فيما يتعلق في النساء تدفع الفاتورة مضاعفة عن الرجل في المناطق اللي فيها صراعات. هي التي تتحمل فاتورة الحماية والكرامة وحتى الحياة المعيشي للناس لأسرتها. فبالتالي النساء إن أكثر من يتعرض للانتهاكات. الأشخاص ذوي الإعاقة، متخيل إنه منطقة تقصف الأشخاص اللي ما عنده إعاقة حركية، الناس بتهرب، والأشخاص اللي عندهم إعاقة حركية ما بيقدروا يتحركوا في الموضوع. تخيل أنت الناس ضرير وصارت قصف لعمارة وانهدت العمارة، كيف ممكن هو يدبر حاله في هذا الموضوع؟ فبالتالي الأشخاص ذوي الإعاقة في حالة الطوارئ يجب أن يكون هناك انتباه عالي جدا لهم، أكثر من يعني توجهاتنا في الأوضاع العالية. وبالتالي هذا يحتاج لتنمية وتدريب الكادر التربوي بشكل عام، المعلمين، مشرفين، مرشدين، مدراء مدارس. هذا يحتاج إلى تدريب كبير جدا ليكونوا قادرين للتعامل ليس فقط مع الأحداث المادية، وأيضا مع الأحداث النفسية، مع الجوانب النفسية والاجتماعية، مع المنظومة القيمية، مشان يقدروا يخلوا في هناك تماسك للمجتمع. وأخيرا بأكد على إنه في التعليم في الطوارئ يجب أن يكون هناك مشاركة للأطفال والشباب في كل الأنشطة التعليمية لإنجاح أي مسار فيما يتعلق بهذا التعليم. ويعني نهاية هذا كله يحتاج إلى من الحملة العالمية للتعليم إلى تكثيف حملاتها في العمل لوجود سياسات على المستوى الوطني والإقليمي والدولي ضامنة لحماية الناس وكرامتهم في هذه المناطق. شكرا لكم.
Thank you, Rifat. Thank you very much for your presentation. We do really appreciate the way you raise the multiple dimensions of inequality and injustice, as well as your call for emotional learning, global citizenship, and global participation. I am sure there is lots of food for thought for our discussion at the end. And now I want to give the floor to Mr. Alberto Croce from the Republic of Argentina. Over to you, Professor Alberto Croce.
Muchas gracias, Luis. ¿Se escucha bien?
Sí, señor, muy bien.
Quiero mandarle un saludo muy grande a varios compañeros, compañeras, amigas, amigos que estoy observando presentes en este encuentro virtual. Y me pone muy contento, en particular quiero expresarle mi abrazo a Rifat y a Bernard, dos grandes amigos y luchadores por el derecho a la educación. Y agradecer también la invitación de la campaña mundial, el ICAE, el Foro Global de Juventud de Estudiantes y todas las organizaciones que han co-convocado este evento, que como Ministerio de Educación de la Argentina tenemos el agrado de auspiciar. Bueno, el tiempo que yo tengo para exponer es bastante breve y quiero ser respetuoso con el mismo porque entiendo que eso colabora a que otras personas también puedan presentar lo que tienen que compartir. El tema central, o lo que quisiera presentar aquí, que tiene que ver con este tema que hoy se nos propone, es cómo estamos con este objetivo 4 de desarrollo sostenible en mi país, porque no tanto para hablar de mi país, sino también porque puede servir quizás de referencia para lo que pasa en otras regiones y en otros países, como recién nos mencionaba el presidente de la campaña mundial, Rifat Sabah. Argentina le tocó que antes de la pandemia del COVID vivió una situación política muy delicada con la administración anterior al gobierno que actualmente tenemos y del que formo parte. hemos vivido una situación muy dura porque el país se endeudó durante esos años en más de 50.000 millones de dólares con un crédito tomado con el Fondo Monetario Internacional, que es el crédito más grande que ha dado el Fondo Monetario, y que nos ha de alguna manera condicionado el futuro, creo que por muchas décadas en adelante, porque es un crédito muy difícil de devolver en las condiciones actuales por las que está mi país. Entonces, ese crédito fue otorgado en su momento prácticamente para tratar de garantizar la continuidad del gobierno que lo recibió, pero afortunadamente la población rechazó y cambió de signo político, cambió el gobierno, pero la deuda esa quedó pendiente y tenemos que hacernos cargo de la misma, como digo, por muchos años, décadas, y que van a pesar sobre nosotros y nuestros hijos. En este contexto, cuando salíamos de esta situación, llegó el COVID-19, la pandemia que atravesó al mundo entero, y por eso en Argentina a veces decimos que hemos atravesado o estamos atravesando dos pandemias. Una primera que fue política y una segunda que tiene que ver con esto que vivimos todos los países del mundo. Pero quizás también tenemos que mencionar que ahora estamos atravesando una tercera pandemia que tiene que ver con esta guerra que se está viviendo en territorio europeo, pero que tiene la particularidad de que más allá de lo que va sucediendo en las acciones militares, esa guerra está generando consecuencias para todo el planeta de una forma casi desconocida por el mundo hasta hoy, en particular para los países más pobres, que ven afectados sus posibilidades de comprar insumos por los aumentos y la inflación que se está dando, sobre todo en los insumos de energía y de alimentos. Por lo tanto, si bien la guerra está sucediendo a muchos kilómetros, miles de kilómetros de donde nosotros vivimos, la consecuencia de esa guerra está afectando al mundo entero y sobre todo a los países más pobres. Toda esta situación hace que el título de este encuentro, que habla de un mundo roto, un mundo quebrado, sea muy adecuado para entender lo que está pasando en la humanidad en estos momentos y por tanto también en mi país. Frente a esta situación, el Ministerio de Educación Argentina renueva su compromiso por poner al Estado en el centro de la defensa y promoción del derecho a la educación. Entendemos que es imposible en este contexto dejar librada su suerte a la educación y el Estado tiene que jugar un rol muy importante. En este momento yo diría que entre las tareas fundamentales que estamos tratando de llevar a cabo, la primera ha tenido que ver con la revinculación, el volver a traer a las aulas a millones de niños y jóvenes que habían abandonado las clases y la escolaridad a causa de la pandemia. Por un lado hay que volver a vincularlos a la escuela, volver a traerlos, pero por otro lado hay que recuperar y hay que restaurar los daños que la pandemia ha generado, que son muy grandes, desde lo económico, desde lo emocional, desde lo psicológico, también desde lo pedagógico. El segundo compromiso del gobierno argentino en este momento, en el medio de un contexto económico muy difícil para nuestro país, es que no se debilite el presupuesto educativo nacional, y si es posible se aumente, para garantizar las exigencias que el sistema educativo tiene para estos momentos de la población. Y este es un compromiso fuerte que estamos tratando de sostener con muchas dificultades, además por los condicionamientos de los créditos internacionales de los que hablé hace un momento. En este contexto, el grupo latinoamericano y caribeño de países del área UNESCO eligieron a nuestro ministro de Educación, Jaime Persí, como uno de los 2 representantes de América Latina y el Caribe para el contexto mundial educativo. Entendemos que eso tiene que ver con ese compromiso que nuestro ministro viene demostrando con estos temas y con la voluntad de que en el contexto internacional se comprenda mejor la problemática de la educación en América Latina en este contexto económico y social que está viviendo todo el continente. Quisiera destacar también lo que está sucediendo en América Latina con las elecciones que van sucediéndose en los países a partir de gobiernos que expresan intereses diferentes a los que se expresaban hace unos años. Y nos alegramos muchísimo de lo que ha sucedido, por ejemplo, en Chile, de lo que ha sucedido hace poco en Colombia, por mencionar algunos de los países que presentan gobiernos que nos dan gran esperanza a los latinoamericanos. Para terminar, en el minuto y medio que me queda, quiero contarles que también una política del Ministerio de Educación en este momento ha sido y es escuchar a las organizaciones sociales y trabajar en conjunto para responder a los problemas que toda esta crisis viene suscitando. Hay varias áreas de nuestro ministerio que trabajan con organizaciones sociales. Por un lado, acompañando numerosísimas prácticas de educación en los territorios más pobres que vienen haciendo organizaciones sociales de distinto tipo. Desde mi dirección en particular, escuchando, atendiendo y tratando de recibir las inquietudes que presentan, las propuestas, las demandas, organizaciones sociales, por ejemplo, de personas con discapacidad, del pueblo gitano, la comunidad afrodescendiente, la comunidad LGTBQ+, organizaciones que trabajan en la economía popular, organizaciones que trabajan con personas que están en contexto de encierro, detenidas, la educación de personas jóvenes y adultas y demás. Quizás uno de los grandes desafíos que tenemos por delante es que la educación se llene de todas esas causas que las organizaciones vienen impulsando y que los contenidos educativos recojan todas esas luchas que se dan en los terrenos en donde la sociedad civil está jugando roles importantes. Por eso nos ha alegrado mucho participar de este encuentro que de alguna manera expresa esto y queremos desearle y saludar a todos los que van a participar en la misma. Y bueno, creo que he cumplido más o menos con el tiempo previsto, disculpen el apuro y lo sintético, pero privilegiamos respetar el tiempo asignado, que es el tiempo de todos. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Professor Croce. Perfect timing indeed. And I do really appreciate the way you explain how different pandemics intersect your idea of health, work, and political. So it would be good to have this in our discussion at the end. So now I want to give the floor to Mrs. Katarina Popovich, Secretary General of the International Council for Adult Education. Thanks, Katarina, for making time for this event, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Luis. It's really a pleasure to have an opportunity to share some ideas with the colleagues, guest participants here, because it's about the topic that we are all very much concerned with these days. So I had two great previous speakers, so my task is a bit easier because I support very much what they said. So I will add a few things, and if you allow me, I will share a presentation, several slides with you, to talk a bit about right to education and lifelong learning, of course, and the new normality or the post-COVID normality in the world that we consider broken in a certain way, not only because of COVID-19, but also the other crises that were mentioned by my honorable colleagues, the previous speakers. So let me start with something that preoccupies very much us in the education sector. The Transforming Education Summit that is will be convened in September 2022, and the pre-summit just happened just a few days ago in Paris. So the topics, the issues raised here were very much related to the future of education in the post-COVID times, and there are some ambitious goals, some really high ambition that were formulated at the pre-summit already, and that will guide the summit in September. So as you can see here, it's about mobilizing political ambition, mobilizing actions, solutions, solidarity to transform education, to take stock of efforts to recover pandemic-related learning loss. We talk more and more about learning poverty, to reimagine education systems for the world of today and of course tomorrow, and to revitalize national global efforts to achieve SDG 4. So sounds really ambitious, and let me add a few words of Secretary General of UN, Antonio Guterres, and also the words that were repeated in Transforming Education Summit. Everyone is talking, and of course it's mentioned that this is the most massive disruption in learning in recorded history. So we have a huge task, how to build back better, how to recover. And then he's mentioning that if you want to solve crisis, we need a new outlook, a new approach, a major push for the progress. And of course, education should have a central role because it's central to human dignity, to our individual path in lives, but also for countries, for economies. And it's also central to securing peace and building nations, tolerant societies, successful economies, all the important things. So a message from the pre-summit is we need to shift from reforming education to transforming education. Sounds great, but also very ambitious. We need to build forward differently, not as we did now. So, but what is really happening? These are the goals and these are the policy goals. But what is really happening? What we are facing? There are many researches proving that the education gap is growing in many countries around the globe, within the countries, but also among the countries. Learning poverty is increasing. So we're still not on the way to compensate what was missed, what was lost during the COVID-19 pandemic. And there is a danger that more people will be left behind, especially some of the marginalized groups that were mentioned already by previous speakers, like women, people with disabilities, different minority groups, and so on. At the same time, education budgets are shrinking. We know that many schools are reopened, but that's by far not enough. And of course, let me mention, because I'm here representing International Council for Adult Education, we do talk very much about reopening the schools, which is of course necessary, it's the priority. But what happens with adults? What is happening with adult learning education? What happens with 800 million illiterate adults? We know that adult education happens mostly in non-formal and informal sector. And it's really difficult to compensate the learning losses in non-formal and informal learning sector. So what do we have in the reality? How did education respond until now? What we have seen confronted with these high goals? Here is the first and most common response: digital recovery. So access to digital technology is the silver bullet. That's the key word. That's what will help us to compensate the losses. Well, there are more and more studies and research showing that, of course, it will be very helpful and necessary, but that's by far not enough. This is not a silver bullet, although it's very often offered as the magical solution for all the learning losses. Next one, I suppose you won't be surprised by this because that's what you have been looking at for the past 2 years. So why am I putting this? Why am I showing this? Because I'm wondering, really, for 2 years, couldn't we do better, but in the learning and education, but repeating to people how to wash their hands? Well, of course, it's a necessary step and we need it to be reminded, but couldn't we really do better? You see here, this is the company high-speed training, not important, but high-speed training, and then breaking down hand washing in 7 steps and printing posters and repeating it on the media. Is this really the best way to use education and learning in fighting the consequences of pandemic, but also facing future crises? Is this something that will help? Other tips, let me know. Do you know anything here? Do you see anything new here? Work from home if possible. Well, for whom is it possible? Avoid touching your face, avoid crowds, and these kind of things. I mean, very basic things. Did we really need COVID-19 pandemic in order to learn these kind of things? I'm not sure that that's true. Next one, and now it's not about the pandemic, it's something that we see now especially after the start, because of the war in Ukraine. It was mentioned also by my colleagues, especially in Europe, but we tend to forget also wars in other parts of the world. And thank you, Refat, for mentioning that. But now, because of these energy restrictions and the energy crisis, now, okay, there is a heat wave. What should we do? Now we are learning that we should drink more water and, you know, keep cool and so on. Why don't we talk about what did we miss in the context of energy? What happened to the green energy? Why didn't we do something before? Why didn't we do more to secure peace? Not to come to the moment where we have to, of course, to face awful war, but also restrictions in energy and so on. Like, we are dealing with the peanuts, with the consequences, you know, and we are learning things that we all have learned as children. Of course, being reminded from time to time, it's not bad, but I really think we should do better facing the climate change, increasing heat, heating of the air, the war and the armed conflicts and so on. And that's what we are learning, especially through non-formal, informal learning. A few other tips that, well, I believe you really didn't need to be reminded of that to know that. So is that what we need to learn in crisis, for crisis, in order to prevent future crises? Well, I doubt that. I certainly doubt that. And I think what we really need to know and we really need to learn is more a kind of education that will help us to really transform, not to adapt. Oh, there is a heat wave, let's adapt. Of course, we need to adapt, but we also need to learn more about climate change and things that could be done not only individually, but also at the global level. What will countries do? What are we going to do with the big polluters and other things that influence climate and the climate change? So should we simply chase the changes, running after them, running after the technological challenges, or really do some rethinking of the current context? So it means education not only for the resiliences, because it's very passive. We just learn how to face the challenge, how to respond to the challenge that happens at the moment. We need education for action. We also need very much, and Refat was also talking about that, education that will help us to understand more systemic issues, structural challenges, the causes of the things, the causes that are embedded in the global power structures, social, economic, political. We need to understand more about the context. Why are the things happening, the things that are happening? Of course, it's very much about critical awareness, and I will just say Paulo Freire, I don't need to explain more, but also other authors that were saying the most important task of education, and I have to add especially adult education, is critical thinking, developing critical awareness so we understand the context, we understand why the things are happening the way they are happening, and we get knowledge and competencies to change this. And of course, this is a kind of holistic education, not only training how to wash the hands and a few other things, but going more deeper to the causes, to the roots of the problems. So one of the things that we are missing, I did show the example of washing hands, but what we should learn also from the COVID-19 pandemic is how can we learn to live in harmony with nature, with animals. Could we isolate? Should we isolate ourselves for the eternity from viruses, bacteria, from other people who might be carrying viruses and bacteria? Is this really something that we should do? Is this the way out? Or should we maybe learn a bit more about living in harmony with animals, with nature, achieving a natural balance that we have missed? One of the reasons the world is broken is this missing balance and missing harmony. So related to the COVID-19 lessons, I think what is also important, again, I'm moving from, oh, let's wash our hands and keep the distance, is how come COVID-19 pandemic had such a different impact on certain people, groups of people, or certain countries? What are the reasons? So for some countries, and I'm showing here the photo of, well, from, I believe this is probably one of the European countries where COVID-19 was, well, a break. A kind of a break, no traveling, no work in office, but at least a chance, to stay home, to do some gardening and spend time with family and children. Lovely. But what happens with other countries? And I'm bringing only one photo. This is from India. And of course, there are many, many more where COVID-19 caused a real catastrophe. So what we should also try to answer, or the issue we should address, how come? It's a kind of a break, maybe unpleasant, and a real catastrophe for the others. The answer is most probably in a global power architecture, in lack of social justice, in economic, social, political inequalities. But that's what we should do in education, especially in adult education. Those are the answers that we should get from the thinking and rethinking the COVID-19 pandemic. There is another one, and I'm very much concerned about that. And this is what we would like to know as citizens. So we should be citizens who are not obeying the rules of the government, but be in active dialogue with the government. Also, when it comes to COVID-19 measures, we know there were plenty of discussions. So we want citizens who will be able to discuss with the governments and to maybe even accept some measures, but maybe also reduce some if governments are going too far in reducing their rights, especially human rights, rights of the minorities, rights of political opposition, because there are governments who did misuse COVID-19 for that. I'm showing here the example of COVID-19 applications, so tracking the contacts. That's from a democratic country in Europe. Luckily, it was refused. But I was asking many times, I never got an answer. What are you going to do with the data that you're collecting? Every shop, every restaurant, every place where we go, we leave all our data. What are you going to do with the data? Especially after the COVID-19. So this is for civic education, I believe, one of the important tasks, maybe also for the future crisis. So the focus should be on, in both policy and practice, on several questions. First one, how to enable potential of the right to education. We know it's there, it's codified in many international documents and so on. But what happens in the reality, especially for vulnerable marginalized groups, they are really not using or practicing this right. And even worse, they don't have the opportunity to use the other rights where education is a precondition. So this is also the topic for the whole SDG agenda. We are not on the track to achieve the SDG 4 goal. It means all the other goals are jeopardized. No poverty, gender equality, sustainable consumption. Without education, special education, we will not make it. And of course, we need to repeat it all the time. It won't work without support, especially financial support. So limiting or reducing educational budget is not the way out, definitely. We cannot get a cheap way out of the pandemic. What will also not work is business as usual. This is the message from Transforming Education Summit, pre-summit. Reforming will not work, transforming, and that's very serious task. So what will not work is, oh, we will do the same, just a bit more, just a little bit better, we will improve a little bit. No. And additionally, and that's the discussion that I'm bringing here from the UNESCO Conference on Adult Learning Education that was just held just 2 weeks ago in Marrakech in Morocco. And one of the topics was right to education versus right to lifelong learning. Especially for us in civil society, it was out of the discussion. It cannot be replaced. The right to lifelong learning cannot replace the right to education for many, many reasons. And we saw it during the pandemic. Learning was going on in different way, in online space. Learning good things, learning bad things, conspiracy theories, pseudosciences, and so on. So learning is not something that should be given a right to or taken away, right? That is taken away. Of course, it's up to the government, but also other actors to create a supportive learning environment. But right to education is something that is much more, and that's something that we should strive to. And finally, so just as a final message, like broken world that we are talking about cannot be repaired by technological patches. Sorry to use this word, but I have to. Technological patches and digital glue. We need a new social contract to education, and I'm here putting the photo showing the recent UNESCO document, which I really recommend. This is talking really about transformation. about new things that we have to do, about new approaches that will help us to rethink and reimagine our common future, where education will play a central role. Thank you.
Brilliant, Katerina. Thank you very much. And thank especially for reminding us that Sustainable Development Goal 4 is not only about youth and children education. Yes, what happened with the adults and all millions of illiterates all over the world. I do really appreciate that. Thank you, Katarina. And now I will want to give the floor to Mr. Hector Ulloa, the Global Student Forum. Over to you, Hector.
Liz, I will also be sharing my screen right now for you to see a quick presentation. I've been asked to talk about students' rights throughout the pandemic. Just because GSF is a very new organization, I just want to start mentioning that the Global Student Forum is the umbrella organization for the student movement founded in 2019. And so far it represents 202 students' union in 121 different countries. I wanted to start mentioning that the COVID pandemic, as we have seen, as we've heard from the other panelists as well, it really undermined the entire education ecosystem. And this means that it was all the levels. There was no institution or type of education. So schools, vocational training, colleges, universities, they were all affected by the COVID pandemic. However, from the Global Student Forum, since we're an organization that represents secondary and tertiary students, I will be talking about some of the experiences that we have heard of and how we have dealt with them through the consultations with our members. But it is very similar, and it is similar challenges and significant challenges that students face across all these levels. And the main reason where these challenges come from is that there was a sudden shift, right, to virtual learning during COVID-19, and this caught the education institutions and the educators completely off guard and exposed that there was a gap in their preparedness to provide quality education through virtual means. And despite sincere efforts to ensure a smooth transition, students suffered educational losses due to a lack of interaction also with their peers, which was something that was not possible digitally, and also technological barriers and unfair and sometimes even invasive practices during digital examinations. But if we look at COVID-19 and students' rights, it's also good to acknowledge that how the pandemic affected students goes beyond their right to education. And something that we sometimes ignore is, for example, how national lockdowns not only close the physical education spaces for students, but also they damage or cause the temporary or permanent end of their employment in many, many cases. And this then resulted in a loss of income. There was less financial stability for many students, and also it led to increased difficult personal circumstances without leaving them the opportunity to cover many times the costs that they have related to attending school, which, as we know, unfortunately right now in the world, the pocket money that is used to cover school expenses is actually very high. So this was limiting a lot of students, especially from lower economic backgrounds. And in those cases where also students had to feel some responsibilities when it comes to caring of other people in their family, they were also placed in a situation where usually they had to take very precarious works or just try to find whatever way and to save themselves in order to keep on covering the costs of their family during a pandemic, and also trying to fulfill their academic responsibility, which not only places them at a higher risk, but also the communities where they were coming from. And of course, when we talk about the shift to virtual learning, many students and educators, they depended on having their own way to access this virtual learning through technology. And many of the students were just simply not able to access the resources that they needed to participate. And also teachers were not given the sufficient resources to support their students in many, many countries. And also in some cases, they were not, or they required even, let's say, for example, additional training, and they were using more hours that were not being compensated by the government, that were not being acknowledged by the government. And that was ultimately also impacting the amount of time that they had available to support their students and to be there for students, which we have seen in our consultations generated also an overall problem with motivation, both for the learners as for the educators. But if we move forward from this more general picture, when we talk about the specific right to education, that was the main thing that we see that students, when we talk about how their rights were under pressure during the pandemic, is that many of them lost their access to education. They faced the inability to continue education through digital means, and this was especially the case in developing countries or economically disadvantaged communities and families, for whom, for example, affording a tablet or affording a laptop or just having internet access was completely impossible for them. And there was also a big increase in the use of multiple wireless or electronic devices in many homes for many, many long hours in households that were not used to this, which also resulted in increased costs for these households. There were power shortages in some cases in many cities, or also just connectivity issues in countries where students were completely left out of the ability to access online learning because of this. And if we look at the numbers, when we talk about the right to education of students under the pandemic, we see that the schools, how long they were closed, they go from an average of about 20 weeks to 80 weeks, but also there are cases where there was full school years that were lost. So this means that the most marginalized were hit the hardest once again. And it was good that we mentioned adult education, for example, right now, because when we look at the numbers, we know that 617 million children and adolescents are failing to achieve the minimum proficiency levels of literacy, but it's 773 million young adults who are also facing these same problems of not having the basic literacy skills. So it's even more young adults than children and adolescents who are failing at these skills after the pandemic. And this pandemic also forced, there were people losing the right of education, but it was also because there was a shift. The learning side was shifted from schools, from universities, from high schools into the families and the communities. And in many of the developing countries, these communities, these home or family places, simply had no access or no way of providing access to distant learning opportunities. And this led to a big problem in what now is very common to talk about, which is the digital divide, right? Digital divide that greatly impacted students worldwide. Because there was an attempt to retain the same methods for offline teaching, just transfer them into an online environment. And sometimes there was some not enough willingness to try new or creative interactive ways for virtual learning. And this eventually led to a loss of motivation. So we know that the same methods for offline teaching can't be just copied into a virtual environment. And this was also exacerbated in many cases by the lack of regular informal meetings that students have at their learning environments, where students were not able to raise concerns, suggest alternative approaches, or even in many cases exercise critical thinking, which, as it was also mentioned right now, is one of the foundations for having a good educational system, as Pablo Freire has taught us. So on top of that, there were some cases where we saw that even when educators were very good at using digital technology, there are some things that you simply can't have through virtual experiences. And we're talking about more hands-on learning that some students require. For example, when we talk about certain sciences or medicine, which ultimately meant that there was a decrease in quality for education for some branches of learning, and there was nothing that could be done at the moment to mitigate that. Besides those specific cases with certain branches of education, we know that another group that was very hardly hit by the pandemic was students with disabilities, because they were also increasingly left behind, because if it was hard to adopt offline teaching into online methods, we see that it was even harder, and there was a big failure in adapting or providing, for example, software or schedules that cater to the specific needs of students with disabilities. If that wasn't enough, another thing that we have seen in students worldwide is also that the pandemic had a very big psychological toll on students. And the mental health and the well-being of students and educators has also been historically neglected. It's not something that started with COVID-19, but it was further exacerbated by the pandemic. So keeping up with the demanding academic programs, for example, during a global pandemic, while also being forced to stay at home and cut off many of the support systems that you would find in your educational institution, push many students to a breaking point, and we have seen this now. Some of the most common psychosocial issues for students during the COVID-19 were fear. There was also distraction, a lot of lack of motivation, a lot of stressful situations for them. And this was greatly increased in those cases where the students already had pre-existing mental health conditions. Something that was especially hard for many under these circumstances, and realize something we forget to think about is how the COVID was the pandemic was affecting all of our families, because there was sickness and there was death of loved ones, which had a catastrophic event of many students, especially when you were looking at these situations happening so repeatedly in short spaces of time. And when you had students that were, for example, living away from home and had to deal with this trauma in a completely isolated space. So managing these multiple difficult responsibilities, such as caregiving, for example, was another thing that students had to face. Having the expectation of maintaining that high academic standard, plus being also the caregiver in at home, created a workload that was just impossible to keep up with for many students. This is especially the case for female students in those societies where it is perceived that they are the sole responsibles for caregiving in their families, which we know it's not the case. So it was an added task for them, while the expectations on academic performance were never decreased in many cases. For those students also that were or come from homes with abusive or neglectful home situations, they also had to face now the situation where they were forced to stay alone and have their academic experience in this harmful environment. So we also need to remember that the closure of institutions in many occasions represented also the closure and the exclusion for many students of the only safe space that they had to be themselves or to express themselves. And once again, this is especially important for marginalized groups. Let's say, for example, the LGBTQI+ community, where their safe spaces sometimes is at institutions and it's not at their own homes. Going a little bit away from these very personal experiences that learners were having in their educational experiences, we also see that there was a need for increased public control in many countries in order to reduce the infection rates. And this gave the authoritarian rulers all around the world the perfect excuse to set in motion increased surveillance and approve new regulations, which the pretext was always we're combating the pandemic, right? But they were aimed at reducing civic space and in many cases silencing critical voices such as the student movements. Increased surveillance was felt by many students through the increased use of cyber tools to track online activities. I was also going to mention the example of COVID tracking apps and how we didn't know what that data was being used for. But also there was an unproportional use of police forces in many cases and abusive legislations that directly affected the students' both freedom of speech, but also their freedom of association in many places where students gathered at universities, for example, and student movement was a vibrant thing that was completely shattered down by COVID regulations. So many students face prosecution due to their criticism toward the government. Several organizations had also their offices closed or their activities canceled, even at times or in occasions where the infection rates were low and when these student activists and these student organizations were actually fulfilling all the safety measures that were required to have activities, for example, during that period. So it was only an excuse to use this COVID legislation to crack down on students. And this is very clear when we look at some of the reports on attacks on students. For example, during the pandemic year from 2020 to 2021, Scholars at Risk has a Free to Think report, and there they have documented 140 incidents of attacks on student expression. And we believe that this is just the tip of the iceberg because it was very hard to document how these things were happening during the pandemic. However, we do know that many of these cases have gone completely unpunished, and they have always been framed as the government just fulfilling the responsibility of controlling infection rates in their country. So in the most extreme case that we have seen, we know that student activists, long prosecuted student activists or student leaders, for example, faced jail time during the COVID pandemic. So there were long-standing critical voices that had already been at risk of being jailed. And then under weak arguments framed around the infection control measures, the government seized the opportunity and punished a lot of these student activists. And most often note the arguments around how they were violating COVID restrictions is very weak. And the political motivation behind this kind of prosecution is very self-evident. So all of these problems, what have we learned then as students? How can we move forward? What can we learn from this pandemic? First of all, is that education must be regarded by governments and other decision-making stakeholders as an essential right to be safeguarded in emergency situations like a pandemic, for example. And this is education needs to be alongside other critical services such as health and shelter. It needs to be there as a top priority and protected. And if we also view education as a right and not a privilege, that means that the lack of financial ability to afford an electronic device or to have very good internet connection during a time of crisis should not deny any student from the right to education. So to combat that inequality, we need governments to invest more money in providing these tools, and that investment needs to be especially focused towards reaching the most economically disadvantaged students by, for example, giving free or subsidized devices or data packages that will enable them to continue their education. At the same time, there is now a clear need to eliminate something that is called the deserts or all those rural areas. We need to invest in connectivity infrastructure in rural and poor areas for those students to also have the opportunity to have access to the internet and engage in virtual education. Just two last points when it comes to mental health. And now we know that many students reported an absence of efforts to support them during the COVID pandemic. There was an extra burden as a result of the pandemic, and this was not acknowledged by the authorities. So we need more flexibility. Students have showed that they need more flexibility around academic deadlines, tuition fees, school payments, workloads, and class schedules, just to ease the psychological hardships that many students are still facing. And also the need for informal spaces where there's peer communication and student sharing, socializing arenas is very much needed, because the COVID pandemic showed us how if you isolate a student from its community, this will just lead to increased isolation, less critical thinking, and loneliness among them. For the last two things that I mentioned, which was the need to protect those student activists under attacks, what we see is that there is a need to conceptualize that term that I have been using throughout all this presentation with students' rights. What is the students' rights? So we need to conceptualize that even better. We know that there are some there have been some significant developments in this area. We have the Student Voices Bill of Rights in the United States, or the European Student Union's Student Charter. But what we need is global collaboration among students to reach a universal understanding of the rights that they have, and also the rights that they have while they are having their educational experience. So if we have that universal understanding, we can then start to work around documenting and reporting violations against students' rights. And here, when it comes to documenting and reporting violation against students' rights, I'm going to close with a very shameless self-promotion for the Global Student Forum and the Norwegian Students and Academics International Assistance Fund, SAI, because they have just started a collaboration on something called the Students' Rights Watch, which the goal is precisely to better document how are students attacked, who is attacking students, and then also how can we provide protection to these students, which is something that we saw during the pandemic is very, very much needed. And we also need a lot of collaboration from the educational community, so we hope to enable that collaboration in the future. Thanks a lot, Luis.
Thank you, Hector. Thank you very much. Yeah, happy to hear more and to engage with this idea of student rights. So now we have some time for questions, so please feel free to open your microphone. If you want to show your face and ask a question or just provide a comment to our speakers. Okay. Mohammed, go ahead, Mohammed, with your comment or question.
Hi, everyone. My name is Mohammed from DVV International. I have a comment with a question in the end. Is like we see always the issues. Maybe this is the nature of our background, that we see the issues and we try to solve them. But sometimes there is a need for not an issue. Like the world is changing faster than before. So education, normal education is not, let's say, strong enough or capable of giving the essentials to students or learners. So the lifelong learning maybe have more potential to cover, to improve civic engagement, or to improve work, labor market. I mean, how we can think outside of the issue box or issues box, and how to engage with government and with donors in this regard. That's my question. Thank you.
Thank you, Mohammed. Do you want your question being answered by any particular speaker?
I mean, yeah, it's general. So,
okay. Yeah. So, any volunteer? Go ahead, Katarina. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks for Mohammed for this question. It's good to see DVV International colleagues here, because they are part of this global policy making as civil society actors supporting adult education in so many countries. And it's great to see that exactly those people are rethinking our current approaches. Of course, there is no simple answer to this question. What I would like to say is that as practitioners, as researchers, as partners in the policy dialogue, we should remain critical all the time. And we shouldn't simply buy the existing or the offered answer and solutions. And we did mention some of those examples, like digitalization of education as a magical solution for everything. So we shouldn't blindly follow the agenda, being it the agenda of our governments or regions, regional bodies, or the global agendas, if we don't agree with that, if we don't see that this is really beneficial for the changes we want to see among people we work with, among beneficiaries, among different groups, especially marginalized groups. So, of course, it's not easy, but I believe we did play already this game is in following blindly, being a good partner, showing that we know the problems we can contribute, but staying on the path, so buying the narratives. So I think we should be more critical towards existing narratives and offer solutions, and offer our experiences and our best practice example, our research evidences, if you are also researchers, and showing that there are other ways, showing what are the ways of transforming and not reforming. So a brief answer, not really an answer, but just one of the maybe possible approaches.
Thank you, Katarina. Rifat, Alberto, Hector, do you want to add something, or? Go ahead, yes. Hector, please. And then Rifat.
Okay. I will answer Muhammad in Arabic. محمد طرح قضية مهمة اللي لها علاقة في تعليم الكبار، ويمكن غابت عن ذهننا أثناء الحديث عن أزمة التعليم في مناطق الطوارئ أو مناطق الصراع. هذه القضية في الحقيقة إنه من خلال رؤيتنا المباشرة لما حدث أثناء الجائحة وما يحدث في طول هذه الفترة في البلدان التي نعمل فيها والتي يعني تعيش حالة صراع، ليس فقط طلاب المدارس من هم متضررين من قضايا أزمة التعليم. للأسف إنه الكبار، إذا يعني الكبار والمقصود منهم كل من خسر الفرصة أن يلتحق في التعليم الرسمي، وكل من هو موجود في التعليم الرسمي ولكن لا يوجد لديه المهارات والمعارف الكافية للتعامل مع الحياة. هؤلاء في هذه الجائحة وفي هذه الصراع هم أكثر من تضرروا. يعني انظر للأمهات أو للبائعين المتجولين أو للعمال في المصانع أو المزارعين في الأرض أو أولئك العمال الذين يعتمدون على قوت يومهم من خلال بعض المهارات. هذه الفئة جميع السياسات حتى سياسات الحماية الاجتماعية لم تهتم بهم، وبالتالي هم أصبحوا خارج إطار اهتمام السياسات، وخاصة فيما يتعلق في تعليم كل برامج تعليم الكبار. يعني ليس سرا إن قلنا أن كثير من البلدان في هذه الأزمات وهذه الجائحة أغلقت مراكز تعليم الكبار وأغلقت برامج تعليم الكبار، ناهيك عن وقف تمويل برامج تعليم الكبار القائمة أصلا، إلا ما ندر في بعض البلدان. وبالتالي بالضرورة أن تهتم المؤسسات الدولية والحملات الدولية وخاصة الحملة العالمية للتعليم في هذا الموضوع، وأن يكون جزء من الأجندة الوطنية بحيث أنه يجري الاهتمام على مستوى السياسات وبالتالي على مستوى التمويل وعلى مستوى تنفيذ برامج فاعلة للتعاطي مع هذه الفئة التي خسرت قوت يومها وخسرت أمنها الاجتماعي وأمنها الصحي وأمنها الحياتي. وبالتالي كثير من الفئات التي نتحدث عنهم سواء كانوا متعلقين بالأشخاص ذوي الإعاقة أو بالمناطق المهمشة أو بالمناطق البعيدة أو الفئات الفقيرة أو الناس الفقيرين أو الأميين، هم من الفئة التي نتحدث عنها فيما يتعلق في تعليم الكبار. وبالتالي الآن نحن نحتاج إلى إعادة النظر في كل البرامج تعليم الكبار التي فشلت بالوضع الطبيعي، فما بالك في المناطق التي تعاني من صراعات. بالتأكيد هناك حالة من الفشل في هذه البرامج تحتاج إلى إعادة قراءة وإعادة تجديد مفهوم نفسه تعليم الكبار بحيث نخرج من الصندوق كما قال محمد الذي نعيشه طول هذه الفترة. شكرا لكم.
Thank you, Rafat. Now, Hector, please try to address for everyone the question in no more than 2 minutes, so we will have more opportunities to hear other people. Yeah, go ahead, Hector, please.
I'll just make a quick comment. It's a very hard question, but something that we need to take into account is always this coordination when we look at education as a lifelong experience, that the different levels within the educational system also connect and are relevant to all the learners that are going through all of them. And one thing is also connecting the different educational systems, which, for example, I have noticed in the Transforming Education pre-summit and the summit that will happen later. This is something that is clearly lacking in many of the discussions. There's no connection across levels, and you can't have a strong schools, for example, if you also don't have a strong free academia that is also enhancing research in your university, right? So one thing is across the educational levels, and the other thing is across society. How do we include these other members? How do we include civil society? How do we include the most marginalized groups? How do we also bring inside our educational systems their ways of viewing the world that have historically been excluded, which is another thing that we greatly require in the education system. And I feel this coordination across members of society and across systems can sometimes help in this goal and answer this huge question that you threw on us.
Thank you, Hector. Wondering, Alberto, you want to add something? Please feel free to say no. Okay, that is absolutely fine. So any other question or comment for the speakers? Please raise your hand or just simply open your microphone and ask the question. I don't see any hand raised, so I will take this opportunity to ask Katarina a question. I am very, very fascinated, Katarina, about this idea of education rather just to responding to crisis for action. And you also talk about transformation of education. So my question, what kind of transformations we need to take into account to really address the issue of students and learners addressing change rather than just adapting themselves to everyday emergencies?
Indeed, we are so busy with reacting to various crises. We had financial crisis, then, climate crisis, I mean, still going on. COVID-19, war and armed conflicts. So we are so busy with mitigating the consequences that we really forgot to think about it. What can we do to maybe prevent some of them, or at least to reduce the size and the bad consequences previously, before they really create a catastrophe for so many people. So that's the transformation that reflects what's going on, that reflects the global structure, that reflects the relationship, and causes and consequences. And well, that's basically critical reflection, of course. And that's what many people, especially in adult education, were talking about. We did mention Paulo Freire, but there is also Jack Merzirov and a few others. Most prominent figures in adult education, for example, were saying, this is the main task. Learning skills, learning some competencies. Of course, it's important, but that's not problematic. That's not difficult. Difficult is to raise this critical consciousness, but that's also risky. For some authorities, while critical citizens that will question what you do, that will question the system that is created, the existing system, the existing power relationships, that might be a risk for the system. So that's why they keep us busy with consequences, resiliences. Allow me to quote the president of our organization, Roberto Guevara, who said recently about resilience, highly appreciated word. He said, resilience is like you punch me, but then I expect you to punch me back and I should be prepared. So resilience is about, I should be prepared for the next punch, by climate change, by catastrophe, by authoritarian government or something like this. So education that should really transform should go back and say, wait, why? Why? And then questioning the structure, questioning the system. This is similarly like in science. If you don't question, you cannot move. And I believe every society is a product of negotiation between policymakers and the citizens. And this continuous process. And COVID-19 and other crises, they give us more food for thoughts, more arguments. It's like big experiment that we did not want, but since it happened, we should use it to continue with the good arguments, the discussion between citizens and authorities about what kind of system we want, what kind of relationship, what kind of world do we want, and what are the best ways to achieve them. There is no easy way, there is no ideal way, but still this is something that we should together work on. So education should prepare citizens for that. Give them arguments, give them critical thoughts, give them really, reflective approaches that will help them going beyond the amount of information. Click on the Google, Google will know. Wow, we don't need education anymore. Well, it's easier to access the information today, and asking Google or application, it's very easy, luckily. But there is a long way from collecting information to developing a critical consciousness. And I believe we should really focus more on that task than developing skills and competencies, which is important, but it's also a hard thing to do.
Thank you, Katarina. Brilliant. Thank you very much. Also, I want to invite the speakers to ask questions between yourselves or a comment to your presentation. That is absolutely fine. And also really encouraging people to take advantage of this very fascinating group of panelists to ask questions or provide comments.
May I ask, maybe, I would ask Alberto if he's online. I know he really, I would like to ask him a question. I mean, very interesting, this experience of Argentina, really. And putting it, Alberto, can you hear me?
Sí, sí.
Yeah, okay. Putting it in the context also of what Refat was talking about, this, global development, political powers, donors' agenda, donors-driven agendas, donors-driven goal, and so on. How a big country like Argentina can face this challenge and still not following blindly these agendas? Okay, governments need help, and I understand that you explained it nicely. But is there a way, especially for educated, informed citizens, to help their government not to pay such a high price for this support, for this help? What's your view on this complicated political issue, and where is the role of education in that?
Bueno, Catarina, gracias por la pregunta. Yo creo que los estados tienen una responsabilidad fundamental en este momento respecto de la dinámica económica que estamos viviendo, y que no pueden correrse de esa responsabilidad, ni trasladarla tampoco a la sociedad civil, porque es una responsabilidad del Estado, propiamente dicha, de garantizar el derecho a la educación. Creo que hay una dinámica de relación con la sociedad civil que sí es importante tener, porque creo que las organizaciones sociales, como por ejemplo las que hoy están participando, señalan y le marcan a los estados puntos de la agenda que tienen que tener en cuenta. Pero eso no corre de la responsabilidad del Estado, de que se tiene que encargar de llevar adelante las políticas necesarias para garantizar el derecho a la educación de todos y todas. Porque muchas veces, desde el sector privado incluso, como aquí se ha mencionado, creo que lo mencionó Rifat cuando tuvo su exposición, hay condicionamientos muy fuertes a la acción del Estado o a la acción de las organizaciones sociales respecto a quién se deben dirigir las políticas. Y entonces los estados no pueden perder su capacidad de acción frente a esto por esos intereses particulares. Por otro lado, me parece que hay que trabajar también con las organizaciones sociales, porque hay una cuestión que es fundamental tener en cuenta, que tiene que ver con la escala de los procesos. A veces las organizaciones hacen trabajos maravillosos, pero por la propia realidad no pueden darle la escala que hace falta para una política pública. Entonces también hay que aprender cómo se replican las experiencias de una organización social en una política pública. Porque no siempre se trata de replicar la experiencia o copiarla o reproducirla, sino de aprender de cuáles son las enseñanzas y criterios que tienen esas acciones que se consideran positivas, para que esas enseñanzas puedan estar presentes como criterios orientadores de las políticas. Y esa es otra forma de escalabilidad de los procesos, que no tiene que ver con copiar una experiencia que se puede hacer desde la sociedad civil, pero que muy posiblemente no se pueda aplicar directamente a una política nacional. Y con respecto a esto, creo que también es muy importante para las organizaciones sociales, como las que hoy nos acompañan, tener siempre en cuenta de que la gran misión de cualquier organización es tener muy claro cuáles son las causas que impulsan. Y las causas esas superan a la organización, van más allá que la organización. Entonces, cuando una organización tiene clara cuál es su causa, impulsa esa causa y no impulsa a su propia organización, sino que impulsa aquella causa que le ha motivado a existir o que ha descubierto en lo largo de su historia, porque también esas causas van cambiando y las organizaciones van descubriendo causas nuevas. Entonces me parece a mí que es todo un desafío, que tanto desde el Estado debemos aprender muchas cosas que hacen las organizaciones sociales, pero también las organizaciones sociales tienen que ir aprendiendo esa relación y esa dinámica de relación con los estados, porque el Estado tiene como tarea garantizar el derecho a la educación de todos y todas, y esto siempre es una responsabilidad ineludible, que a veces no permite quizás el apoyo a una experiencia definida de una organización que tiene a lo mejor un alcance mucho más reducido. No sé si he sido suficientemente claro, Caterina, para contestarte, pero bueno, puedo aclarar algo más si hace
Yes,
falta.
thank you very much. So if I got you correctly, basically it's about partnership. Education concerns everyone, and it touches every sphere and sector of human life and work. So everyone has a role and a responsibility, taking part in these decisions and the policy-making process for the whole society. So sharing, taking part, getting education that will help everyone to take the responsibility of this in this important process.
Sí, sí, pero no todos tienen la misma responsabilidad. Y creo que los estados tienen una responsabilidad mayor y tienen que responder por esa responsabilidad mayor ante sus poblaciones. Entonces me parece que hay que entender esa dinámica y hay que exigirla desde la sociedad civil también. Me parece que eso también es importante. No es una alianza, no es la misma alianza que hay entre el Estado y las organizaciones que la que puede haber entre distintas organizaciones. No es igual, no tiene la misma naturaleza esa alianza. Hay responsabilidades diferenciadas, como se dice cuando se habla en los temas de ambiente, ¿no? Que hay responsabilidades diferenciadas. Bueno, aquí también hay responsabilidades diferenciadas.
I couldn't agree more. Thank you for highlighting that. So it's just that in order to be able to be accountable and to make the right decisions, governments should listen to the citizens and ask, and being continuously in touch, in contact with them, civil society or any other association, but also single citizens and so on, listening and not making the decision about them, without hearing their voice. But of course, they are the ones who are accountable. Thanks, Alberto.
Thank you, Alberto, and thank you, Caterina. So I have the kind of difficult task to take, or yes, to put forward some of the main takeaways, and this is really challenging. So rather than just assuming this very big task, I just want to highlight one key idea from my point of view of each speaker. So first of all, I would like to really address or call into attention the point raised by Rifat about the multiple dimensions of inequality and injustice. We talk about inequality and injustice in everyday life. We talk about the many inequalities faced by people with disabilities, people living in refugee camps, and all these different social groups. But at the end, what? What is the role of these groups in this very idea of transforming education? So thank you, Rifat, for really raising all these elements that I do believe we need to really take carefully and to consider, in particular from a political perspective, but also from a practical perspective. What does it mean in terms of policy? What governments should do to really address the needs of people living in refugee camps, facing climate change, and all these emergencies? So regarding our second speaker, Professor Alberto Croce, I do really appreciate your idea of seeing education as a part of a system. You say something like we can take or just leave education by its own. We really need synergies between different sectors to address really the challenges that people are facing in different parts of the world. Of course, not just in Argentina, and of course, not just of the pandemic. You also talk about the war, the conflict, the ongoing war in Ukraine, and how it's shaping our society. And I completely agree with you. People are talking about the impact on the food system and the impact on oil and all this stuff. I haven't really ever heard about what is the impact of the ongoing war in the education systems, in the way we learn about the other, in the way we see the Ukrainians and the way we see the Russians and the way we see the Americans and all the people in between this war. So this is really important, and it really connects with the point I want to highlight from Katarina. Right to education, right to learn are related, but are very different things. And the most important things, and I agree with you, is critical thinking. Are our education systems really helping us to think critically about our realities, about the way we understand the realities, about the way we understand our position as a member of the society, and also related to you said, Katarina, using our voice to say what we believe, and what we believe needs to be transformed in our education systems. And finally, Hector Ulloa, I really like, yes, maybe we can organize an event about this idea of student rights. But for today, I do appreciate the way you frame the different dimensions of the digital divide. I am maybe not agree with the visual material because it's a gap between books and technology. And we really see many people in the world who have no books, no libraries, and of course, no technology because, as you said, have no power, no electricity, no the skills. But this idea of the digital divide, or the possibility that we have some countries who quickly move from face-to-face learning and teaching to digital learning and all this stuff, and countries, as you said, who have no power, no electricity, no skills. What is that? Is really making sense, this idea of not leaving one behind? We are leaving millions, hundreds of millions behind every day. So we really need to take our work seriously and consider what does it mean in terms of policy. And it means at the Global Campaigns for Education, and probably you all are absolutely agree, more finance, more resources, and more skill, and more political commitment to protect everyone's right to education. So I am, yes, sure, it mustn't really make sense of all your ideas you shared, but this is just a short summary of the main takeaways I have personally put in my notes. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you, Rifat, Katarina, Alberto, and Hector, for making time for this conversation. Thank you all the people who joined us today and who really care about the right to education. We want to thank you for your engagement with this seminar, and hope to see you in future events in the near future.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank
Bye-bye,
you.
Alberto. Bye-bye, Alberto. Bye-bye, Katrina.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you all. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
See you all.
Thank you, Rifat, Bernard.
How are you? How are you, Alberto?
Thanks.
Thank you.